Shalom and good afternoon in Israel and Europe. Good morning to those joining us in the United States. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. My name is Shira Efron. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies
מארצות הברית.
in Tel Aviv.
שמי שירה אפרון, אני
Also
נמצאת
with the
בתל
Red
אביב.
Conference and an adjunct scholar at the Modern Warren Institute in West Point. If there is one thing that 2020 underscored so far is the need to rethink our national security agenda. In an effort to do so, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the first INSS International Conference on the nexus between climate change and national security. This conference is also the launch of a research program that will be dedicated to this issue, which, as we will hear today, despite its prominence and magnitude, is really far from being addressed properly. Before we begin, I want to extend my deep appreciation to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Israel for their support and partnership on this conference and the new research program. A special thanks to our distinguished speakers who you will meet in a moment, and thank you all for joining. We encourage you to submit questions on INSS Facebook page. Without further ado, I'll introduce our terrific experts. I'll introduce them just by order of their speaking. They all have very distinguished careers, so we have to condense their bios in the interest of time. Our first guest speaker is a Knesset member, Miki Khaimovich, chairwoman of the Interior and Environmental Protection Committee and deputy chair of Knesset. She's a former award winner journalist and a leader of campaigns for environmental protection and animal rights. Our second speaker is the Honorable Sherry Goodman, who has served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. She is currently a senior strategist at the Center for Climate and Security, a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center and Center for Naval Analysis. She's also a Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She is also the first-born American daughter of Holocaust refugees who escaped from Nazi Germany to the United States just prior to World War II. Welcome, Sherry. Next, we have Sherry's colleague, the Honorable John Conger, who is currently the Director of the Center for Climate and Security, and is also a Senior U.S. Advisor to the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Mr. Conger previously served as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and as the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installations and Environment at the U.S. Department of Defense. Joining us also from Europe is Dr. Louise Van Schaik, Head of Unit EU and Global Affairs at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Klingendale, where she also coordinates all research in the field of climate change and sustainable development. Her research focuses on the EU's performance in multilateral bodies, including in the fields of climate change, health, and food. And last, but definitely not least, sitting next to me, is Professor Colleen Price, who is the head of the Environmental Studies Department in the Porter School of the Environment and Earth Sciences in Tel Aviv University. Professor Price specializes in research on weather and climate change. Couldn't be more relevant for this panel. Knesset member Miki Khaimovich really wanted to be with us today. She had a role in initiating this conference to begin with. However, Knesset is now in session, and therefore she had to pre-record her opening remarks, which we will play now. Please.
הזמנה לקחת חלק בכנס הבינלאומי הזה שעוסק בהשלכות על ישראל והמזרח התיכון של משבר האקלים. לפני בערך שנה, ביום עיון שהיה למפלגת כחול לבן במכון INSS, אני שאלתי לגבי הערכות שנעשות בנושא הזה, ואני מאוד שמחה לראות שאכן הוא נכנס לתוכניות העבודה של המכון ומקבל את תשומת הלב הראויה. לפני כמה שנים, עוד בעבודה שלי כעיתונאית, אני בעצם נחשפתי לראשונה לסוגיה במסגרת סרט שהכנתי על סוגיית הביטחון התזונתי של ישראל. בדרך זה בעצם הבנתי שישראל נמצאת מבחינת משבר האקלים במה שמוגדר כ-hotspot, וההשלכות על ישראל בעצם עלולות להיות קטלניות. ולכן אני חושבת שההכרה בנושא הזה והערכות הם שלב ראשון וקריטי, ולכן אני באמת חושבת שהכנס הזה כל כך חשוב, כי זה בעצם פעם ראשונה שבעצם מדברים על הקשר בין משבר האקלים והסוגיה האסטרטגית הביטחונית של מדינת ישראל. בחצי שנה האחרונה אנחנו נתקלנו לראשונה במשבר כלל עולמי, שמתרחש בעולם גלובלי וטכנולוגי, ואנחנו בעצם יכולנו לראות במו עינינו את ההשפעות חסרות התקדים של כוח חיצוני, שבעצם מתערב בחיים שלנו ומערער את היציבות שלהם. אנחנו רואים השפעות כלכליות, חברתיות, נפשיות, שאף אחד מאיתנו עוד לא ממש יודע להעריך. ואנחנו יודעים שבני אדם מחפשים יציבות. אנחנו רוצים לדעת איפה אנחנו נלך לישון, איפה נתעורר בבוקר, מה נאכל, מה נעסוק. אנחנו נצמדים לאיזושהי מחשבה שהנורמליות בעצם תשלוט בחיים שלנו. וכשאנחנו מזהים משבר שמתקרב ובא, אז האינסטינקט הראשוני שלנו הוא לדחות אותו, להתעלם, להכחיש, לעצום עיניים, ולא לדמיין את ההשלכות שלו על החיים שלנו. וזה מה שאני רואה, הרבה אנשים שבעצם מתמודדים עם משבר האקלים, וזה גם מה שקרה בעצם במקור עם משבר הקורונה, כי היו התראות והיו דיבורים על זה, אבל אנשים העדיפו של לא לחשוב שזה באמת יגיע משהו כזה, זה נגיף קטלני. אז גם אם אנחנו מאמינים שמשבר יגיע, אז ברוב המקרים אנחנו בעצם רואים שלא מוכנים להתמודד איתו מבעוד מועד, וזה מה שאנחנו בעצם מנסים פה היום, להסתכל קדימה וכן להתחיל להתמודד. העוצמה וההרס שיביא משבר האקלים יהיו גדולים בהרבה ממשבר הקורונה, צריך להבין את זה, ולזה לא יהיה חיסון. במדינת ישראל והעולם כולו מתמודדים עם ההשלכות הקשות של משבר הקורונה על כל תחומי החיים שלנו, וכמו שאמרתי, היו כאלה שהטריעו, אבל בשטף השגרה והבעיות של היום-יום, בעצם מתברר שקשה להתפנות ולהפנים את גודל הסכנה וההשלכות רחבות ההיקף, וזה בעצם גם משהו שמאוד מאוד מאפיין את ישראל. חוסר היכולת באמת להסתכל קדימה לטווח ארוך, זה התפקיד שלכם כמכון מחקר, להטריע על הדברים האלה ולצלצל בכל פעמוני ההזקה, ואם אנחנו לא נתעשת, זה מה שצפוי לקרות לנו עם משבר האקלים. אני מצטערת כל הזמן, אני מרגישה כמו התוכי הזה שאומר לומר את הדברים, אבל באמת הקורונה היא רק הפרומו למה שעומד לפתחנו. צריך להבין שמאפייני המשבר יהיו מאוד דומים בתחומים מסוימים, אבל לפי כל התחזיות, העוצמה וההרס של משבר האקלים יהיו גדולים הרבה יותר. הם יימשכו יותר זמן, והם ילכו ויחמירו עם הזמן. והחשש הוא שככל שהמצב יהיה קשה יותר, והנפגעים העיקריים יהיו כרגיל, קודם כל, האוכלוסיות החלשות, אותם עיקרים שנפגעים מהבצורת, אותם אנשים שאין להם ביטחון מזון, אז אי אפשר שלא לצאת מנקודת הנחה שהביטוי, אנחנו נראה אותו בעלייה של מחאה, בגלי פליטים שידפקו פה על גבולות מדינת ישראל, מאבקים, לעתים זה יגיע למלחמות, ואנחנו יודעים שמדברים על זה, שהמלחמות של העתיד אלה מלחמות שיהיו על מים, על משאבים, אלה היו המלחמות של העתיד שלנו, וזה העתיד של משבר האקלים. וזה כבר לגמרי כאן. אנחנו רואים בשנים האחרונות רצף של אסונות אקלימיים קשים ברחבי העולם, גם כאן בישראל אנחנו חווים החמרה בגלי החום, בבצורות, רק בינואר האחרון, בחורף האחרון, אנחנו לא יודעים איך יהיה החורף הבא, אבל אנחנו ראינו מקרי הצפות חמורים שלא היו כמוהם, בצפון מישור החוף, בגוש דן, בנהריה, הם הביאו לאובדן טרגי של חיי אדם, נזקים קשים ברכוש, עסקים, מבנים, תשתיות. תראו מה קורה בעולם עם השריפות, המחירים שהם גובים הם פשוט בלתי נתפסים, אנחנו רואים מה שקורה ממש בימים אלה, את מה שקורה בקליפורניה, התמונות והעדויות שאם אתם עוקבים אחרי מה שקורה שם, התמונות האפוקליפטיות האלה, צמיגים של רכבים שמנסים לברוח, שנמסים מרוב שהכבישים חמים, אנשים שראו שציפורים בשמיים שפשוט נפלו ומתו, מאות אלפים שנמלטים מהבתים שלהם. אנחנו שומעים את המועמד הדמוקרטי לנשיאות ארצות הברית, ג'ו ביידן, שמקשר בין השריפות לשינוי האקלים, ואומר ששינוי האקלים מהווה איום מיידי וקיומי לאורך חיינו, וזה מה שאנחנו צריכים להפנים, גם כאן במדינת ישראל. השריפות האלה, כמו גם באמזונס ובאוסטרליה, באמת הופכות בעידן של משבר אקלים, שבו אנחנו נמצאים לתופעות שגרתיות, אנחנו נראה יותר ויותר מהן. לצערי, הדיון שיזמתי בוועדת הפנים והגנת הסביבה בנושא של ערכות ישראל למצבי קיצון אקלימיים בהקשר הביטחוני, העלה שגופים רבים, ובהם משרד האוצר, המל"ל, מערכת הבריאות, כמעט ולא עוסקים בערכות רצינית. הם באמת, לצערי, לא מפנימים עדיין את עומק השפעות המשבר. הם לא מפנימים את ההשלכות הדרמטיות על ביטחון המדינה, האיום האסטרטגי שיש לשינוי האקלים על המזרח התיכון. ואני חושבת שתפקיד ההנהגה בעיניי הוא להיערך מראש, להכין את התשתיות, לשפר את המוכנות של המשק הישראלי, הרשויות, המערכות כדי למזער את הפגיעה הצפויה של משבר האקלים ברגע האמת למינימום האפשרי, וגם במקביל לזהות את ההזדמנויות, כי יש פה הזדמנויות גם להצמחת כלכלה ותעשייה ירוקה, להשתמש בישראל דווקא כאיזשהו מודל, כי אנחנו עם כל האינוביישן שלנו, עם כל החדשנות שיש לנו, אנחנו יכולים להיות באמת אור לגויים מהבחינה הזאת. וכל זה באמת צריך לעשות בשילוב כוחות של כל הגורמים במשק במדינה, בהובלת המנהיגים הפוליטיקאים, ולצורך זה בדיוק אני מעלה את הנושא הזה שוב ושוב לסדר היום של הוועדה, אני פועלת לקידום שלו ולהעלאת החשיבות בפוליטיקה הישראלית, דיברתי על זה בלא מעט נאומים שלי כאן במליאה, אני לא יכולה להגיד שאני רואה איזו נהירה של פוליטיקאים שיעסקו בנושא הזה, אבל כן יש פה ושם, אני רואה עוד ועוד פוליטיקאים שבאמת מבינים את החשיבות ויש התקדמות, אבל לצערי אני מרגישה שהדרך עוד ארוכה. בסיכום הדיון האחרון קראתי למשרד הבריאות להקים גוף במשרד שיהיה אחראי לנושא משבר האקלים. הדגשתי גם שאנחנו נעקוב אחרי ההצהרה של רחל, של רשות החירום הלאומית, להביא לאישור הממשלה והקבינט המדיני-ביטחוני בתחילת הרבעון הראשון של 2021 תוכנית עם המלצה להכניס את משבר האקלים למפת האיומים הלאומית. זה חייב להיכנס. אנחנו כבר גם פועלים מול ועדת החוץ והביטחון של הכנסת ומול משרד הביטחון על מנת לקדם דיונים משותפים. אני אדבר על זה גם עם שר הביטחון ולשים את היערכות ישראל למשבר האקלים במקום גבוה בסדר היום הביטחוני-לאומי. מעבר לזה, כמו שאמרתי, הדיונים שקיימנו בוועדת הפנים, הדיונים על נושא משבר האקלים, כל פעם אנחנו נעשה את זה מזווית אחרת, בין עם אסטרטגיות יציאה ירוקות, היבטים כלכליים סביבתיים, שמתחברים יותר לעולם המיטיגציה, אבל גם התחלנו עכשיו, כמו שאמרתי כבר, על סדרה של דיונים שעוסקת באדפטציה, ואחרי הדיון הראשון שבדק את ההיערכות הלאומית מול גופי הביטחון, עשינו עוד דיון שני שבו בעצם בדקנו את ההיערכות המקומית של הרשויות המקומיות. אבל למרות כל מה שנאמר, אני באמת לא רוצה לקחת את תפקיד נביאת הזעם, אלא את התפקיד של מי שתורם לשינוי לפני שיהיה מאוחר מדי. אני חושבת שאנחנו פה במדינת ישראל, לצערנו, מכירים ומתורגלים למצבי חירום. אנחנו יודעים לתפעל אותם, יש לנו כוח אדם מעולה, יש לנו טכנולוגיות נהדרות. הדבר היחיד שצריך להיות זה שההנהגה תשים את הנושא גבוה בסדר העדיפויות, ועל זה אני עובדת יום-יום בכל דיון ברשתות החברתיות, בתקשורת ופעולות פרלמנטריות פוליטיות, ואני באמת מקווה שאנחנו נראה תוצאות בהקדם האפשרי. וכמו שאמרתי, כשמדובר באירועים ביטחוניים, אנחנו יודעים אולי להתכונן אולי יותר טוב מכל מדינה אחרת בעולם, וחשוב שאנחנו נזכור את זה כשאנחנו ניגשים למשבר האקלים. אז לסכם ולומר, אני רוצה להגיד שפחד, היסטריה ופניקה, אני לא חושבת שהם יועילו כאן. הפחדה של הציבור אולי יכולה לעבוד לזמן קצר, אבל היא אסטרטגיה שלא רק שהיא בעיניי לא לגיטימית, היא גם לא משיגה את המטרה שלה. בסופו של דבר, ציבור שהופחד הוא לא ציבור שמגויס למטרה, כמו שאנחנו יכולים לראות גם היום במשבר הנוכחי. אני חושבת שאנחנו כמנהיגים, יש לנו חובה להבין, לראות ולכבד את רחשי ליבו של הציבור, ביחד עם זאת להוביל אותו אל עבר מטרה משותפת. אנחנו צריכים למלא את הצד שלנו בהסכם, כדי שהציבור יכבד את המילים ואת המעשים שלו, את המעשים שלנו, ואנחנו לצערי הרב, אנחנו רואים את זה היום בנוגע לסגר וחוסר האמון שיש. אז אם אנחנו נראה לציבור מוכנות ורצינות כשאנחנו מתייחסים למשבר האקלים, לדבר עליו בטון מנהיגותי ולא בהפחדות, לרתום את הציבור, את ההנהגה המקומית, להפחית את הזיהום, למוכנות ומודעות למשבר, להליכה ביחד בדרך משותפת, שכל אחד מצהיר על הכוונות שלו. אז אני חושבת שאנחנו נצליח לקדם את הנושא הזה, ואני יודעת שהמילים שלי נופלות על אוזניים קשובות אצלכם שם. אני רוצה להגיד תודה לעמוס ידלין שבנה את הכנס הזה, לאחר אותה שיחה שהתקיימה בינינו לפני כשנה. אני מאוד מעריכה את העובדה שאתם מקיימים את הכנס הזה, ואני בטוחה שהוא יתרום להיערכות העתידית שלנו. וזהו, ואני באמת רוצה לנצל את ההזדמנות הזאת, לאחל לכולם שנה טובה, ושנהיה כולנו בריאים, ונצלח את המשבר הזה, כשאנחנו עושים את הפעולות הנכונות בצורה בהירה, מדברים בצורה מנהיגותית ואחראית, ושנלמד להבא לקראת המשבר הגדול הבא שעומד לפתחנו, משבר האקלים.
were that she sees the climate crisis as the #1 threat. Sadly, despite the magnitude of this crisis, it's not incorporated yet into Israel's national priorities and to its national security agenda. She also said, and I appreciate that they're not just risks. This crisis also can lead to new opportunities, which I think domestically in Israel, but I think it's also important to remember this also in terms of the regional approach. As I think everyone here will know, in a few hours, Israel will sign normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And there could be opportunities for cooperation on climate change with two Persian Gulf countries that arguably are even more vulnerable to climate change than us here. So we're going to open up our panel discussion with our terrific experts. Ms. Goodman, Sherry, let's begin with you. Can you please explain the nexus between climate change and national security? Why is climate even a national security issue to begin with? And if you can also elaborate how this nexus manifests itself in our region in the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. And I congratulate you for organizing this first climate and national security conference in Israel. And it's a special honor and privilege for me, being the daughter of Holocaust survivors. I've been coming to Israel since I was 13 for my bat mitzvah. And I was there just a year or so ago. So it's really a special privilege. And I think that you present in Israel an opportunity to showcase what the opportunities are now at this time of crisis. So, we face an unprecedented crisis today, not only with climate change, but with the pandemic, with COVID. COVID and climate are converging and cascading risks that are upending our societies and producing new insecurities, even in an already unstable world and the unstable region in which you have lived in Israel now for millennia. And we finally see this here in the U.S. in the most apocalyptic way, as you well know. Now, climate science is not new. It's been around for 30 plus years. But 13 years ago, the first group of U.S. military leaders came together to form a military advisory board to examine the national security implications of climate change. And why did they do that? Well, they didn't have the fires of California in front of their face with people dying from climate-fueled fires, nor the floods in the Midwest, nor the hurricanes devastating much of our East Coast. But we could see already 13 years ago that stronger storms, higher temperatures, melting Arctic sea ice, prolonged drought across much of the Middle East and other parts of both the U.S. and South Asia was already beginning to affect the security and stability of our planet and of our military forces as they deploy around the world. And so we began to look at this as a threat multiplier. A threat multiplier, we characterized climate change as a threat multiplier back in 2007 with the CNA Military Advisory Board report on climate change and national security. And that has led to a whole generation of work integrating climate change into our national defense strategy, our national security strategy, and other key intelligence and security documents. And that has been very, very valuable work that's been carried forward by the Center for Climate and Security, where I'm now affiliated, which John Conger runs. And today we even have an international military council on climate and security, which Louise is also very much involved in from her think tank in the Netherlands, where we are galvanizing the work of military and national security professionals from around the world to address this most urgent threat. And now we see with the apocalyptic news from California, with the denial, with a climate denier and a climate arsonist, if you will, at the top of the U.S. home, what the consequences are for Americans and what they could be around the world. Now, on the Erev of Rosh Hashanah, I think we should come on recognize that there is hope of renewal. So there is an opportunity, I think, to reset our societies in a more constructive way. And that is, in the US, it's framed as sort of build back better, recognize that there are jobs to be had as we move to a clean energy economy, as we move to wind and solar, as we will rebuild our infrastructure to be more resilient to the ravages of climate change. Now, I'd say in Israel, you have long recognized that natural resources are an element of your natural power, element of national power, as water has always been so fundamental to Israel's existence. So water and food, you made the desert green, and that has been a marvelous, marvelous thing. So it's bred into your very being, I think, as Israelis, to understand the role of resources in our security, food and water security. And now I think you have additional opportunities for renewal with these openings with the UAE and with Bahrain to engage in water, energy, potentially food security arrangements that will improve the stability, security, and economic opportunities throughout the region. And with Israel's technological prowess and with the cooperation that can be had with these new arrangements, and including the US and other industrialized nations, I think there are great opportunities to move our countries, our nations forward into this lower carbon, climate-proofed world. So I'm very excited about that. I'm excited that you're galvanizing and bringing people together here, and very happy to be part of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and I really appreciate your positivity. It's hard to be so positive and enthusiastic in this time, and I really appreciate it. Also, I think it is important you mentioned that climate denial in the US, and indeed, when people think about the US, they think, climate is a politically controversial issue. However, it sounds also that there is a consensus, at least in the national security community, at least a 13-year-old consensus, that it is a threat multiplier, as you said, and I think this is really something that is really important to communicate. So thank you for that. John?
Yes, I'd say that consensus holds not only in the national security community, and as John will talk about, also in large parts of the Congress, the US Congress, on a bipartisan consensus on the national security considerations of climate change.
And any bipartisan agreement today is welcome and appreciated. Thank you very much for that, Sherry, and I'll get back to you with more questions later. John, Sherry spoke about climate as a threat multiplier, and that is acceptable, I think, across the board, but is the discussion about climate change context dependent? In other words, when you and your colleagues speak about climate security in the US, is it the same in Europe? And if you can envisage, I don't think that there is this concept yet, but what would climate security mean for the Middle East?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to speak to you. I think it is important to understand context when you talk about climate security, and it's important not just internationally talking to different countries, but depending on who you're talking to within your country, you're going to have a different point of view, and you have to meet people where their interests are. When we sort of arranged this issue and talked about this issue within the U.S. Department of Defense, it was very clear that the military was a little bit less interested in emissions, but much more interested in their missions and how climate change affected their own individual missions, whether that was extreme weather on military bases or sea level rise affecting infrastructure or wildfires cutting out, making you evacuate bases. Those were things that were direct interest. In the U.S., I think there was also a significant amount of interest in as there was a priority on great power competition, those things that Russia and China might be involved in. And so the Arctic became a very big interest item. As we started looking at and having conversations with folks in the United States, talking about the Arctic was very much aligned with the topics they wanted to discuss within great power competition. And so if you look at Europe, the priorities within the security frame are a little bit different. As you look in the Middle East, the priorities in the security frame are a little bit different. So you look at China, their security strategy is a little bit different. And everybody has to look at not only what climate effects are affecting their region, but what security interests they have. And when you put both of those lenses together, you get a different picture. So I talked about infrastructure and the Arctic, and Sherry talked about the threat multiplier dynamics as interest items for the United States. Well, okay, let's take a different country and look and see what is their security strategy and what are the climate impacts. And so let's look in the Middle East for a minute or two. You have drought issues, you have water security issues, you have refugee issues, food security dynamics, and all of these things are the climate overlay. These are happening, whether you consider it a security issue or not. But if you look at what happened in Syria, a record drought caused massive dislocation within their country. They already were struggling with refugees from the Iraq War. And so this added to the dynamics that created instability in Syria right next door. Drought has, therefore, a palpable security implication in this region. And water, availability of water is going to have that same dynamic. Food security is going to have that same dynamic, and the resultant refugee flows are going to have that same dynamic. So it's all interrelated, but you have to look at it through your local lens and through your security lens. And so when you're dealing with all these problems, let me close with this thought. Some of the skeptical audiences, whether it's within your country or from different countries, they're going to say, so you're telling me that climate change is a bigger threat than the ones I'm dealing with right now? I might have a hot war going on over here or civil unrest over there. You're telling me climate change is a bigger deal? And the trick is, that's the wrong question. The question is not, is climate change, if I'm talking to, let's say, a conservative politician in the United States, it's not whether climate change is a bigger threat than China or Russia or those different dynamics when you're talking about great power competition. It's how does climate change affect all of those things? It is part of every one of the threats you already care about. It is not different. It is part of the equation, and you have to put it through that lens. And so if you are concerned about, adversarial actions from countries in your region, how does climate change affect their behavior? How does drought affect their behavior? How do energy dynamics affect their behavior? Because climate change is part of that calculation and part of that discussion. It's not, we have to stop thinking about or and start thinking about and it is additive in that context. I think that so whenever you're going to look at this question, if you're going to look internal to Israel, and every agency is going to think about it differently too, and you're going to have to put it through their lenses, because ultimately you have to meet people at their own interests. The defense forces are going to care about a certain set of priorities. The environmental officers are going to care about a certain set of priorities. And you can't get one to care about the other's priorities inherently. You have to have them take the correct actions that are in their own interests that happen to overlap. And that's how things have worked, and we've made a lot of progress doing that in the United States, despite the political polarization around climate change. Now, I'll stop there and wait for more questions.
Thank you, John. I think this is a really important perspective. What is the best tactics to get decision makers to listen and think how climate change exacerbates maybe threats that they are thinking about anyway. There's no, you also mentioned the civil war in Syria. We do know today that a prolonged drought have led to migration from rural areas into the cities, which eventually exacerbated ethnic tensions here in Israel. We are still feeling the ramifications of that civil war until today. And you talk about adversaries. I want to remind our audience that temperature in some cities in Iran reaches 54 degrees Celsius, which is 130 degrees Fahrenheit in the summers. So this is something, just another lens to look at the issues. So thank you for that, John. Luis, both John and Sherry spoke about the U.S. perspective, United States perspective. What is the European position on climate change and security? Is there a differentiation in policy between key countries like Germany? Does Germany think about climate security the same as France? And I think it would be also helpful for our context to understand to what extent is Europe worried about climate and security in the Middle East and North Africa? In terms of what happens in our region affects your region.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and also for contributing to this discussion. So I was really pleased to see that Israel is now also starting up a research program on this issue, because I also think and I believe that you have a lot to bring to this agenda because of your own experience also in the MENA region with the same climate as some other countries where we can see real issues with climate security and where Europe indeed is very much concerned. So I see also a lot of potential for collaboration. Well, first of all, the EU is, I think, rather united on this issue. That being said, sometimes it's an issue where more, let's say, lip service is being paid for than actual action is being undertaken. So climate change is recognized as a threat multiplier since the early 2000s. It appeared in the European Security Strategy of 2003. And also the UK and France and Germany and others have been very active in the UN Security Council on the issue since 2007. There was a report by the High Representative Solana and also efforts related to the Paris Agreement. And also in 2018, Mogherini organized a high-level debate. Now that issue is included in the Green Deal. But that being said, I think the issue was pushed very much by the US. So the link between climate change and security, I would say, until 2018 has been an issue that has been recognized by the EU. But with regard to what should we actually do about it and how severe is it and what are the implications for the military, I feel that the US was way ahead, and that has also to do with people like John Conger and Sherry Goodman that really understood the issue and pushed for the issue. But I guess it also has to do with the fact that if you want to elevate an issue on the political agenda in the US, then highlighting the security dimension is very important. Whereas in the EU, people also feel a bit at unease if you turn something into a security issue. And let me talk a bit more about this. So in the EU, everybody is convinced of the urgency of climate change and the severity of the issue. But it's framed more as an issue of an environmental or an economic challenge. And also the way to address it, the EU likes to present that it's still possible to do something about climate change. So it is an economic opportunity to be a front runner in the energy transition. This would be good for the EU's competitive position. And we don't want China to become the ultimate front runner in the renewables, but we also want a role for Europe in the battery technology, and in the we also want to become less dependent on oil and gas imports from Russia and the Middle East. So there's also kind of energy security interest that aligns with the climate change interest. So this is very much the frame. And for a long time, let's say, adaptation to climate change, the consequences of climate change, climate security, I guess felt a bit of a defeat. You accept already that climate change is ongoing, that it has disastrous effects. And a lot of people, especially in the environmental circles, in the development circles, said, no, we should try to fight it. We should go for an ambitious Paris Agreement. And then we can still halt these negative consequences. And they also, in a way, perhaps feared a bit that the securitization would, lead to political misuse of the climate change issue. I guess now this is over. A reality check is kicking in that climate change is there, that it will not go away, and that it has the security implications, that even in Europe we suffer, from droughts and temperature changes that are really severe. So I guess gradually, let's say the climate security issue is more becoming a reality also for us here in Europe. In the Netherlands, it's 30 degrees today, on 15th of September, which is quite exceptional. So it is really slowly kicking in. And we also saw that some of the EU member states were really championing this issue when they had a temporary seat in the UN Security Council, like Sweden, the Netherlands, now Germany. Sometimes I've expressed this is almost a beauty contest, and it also, let's say, to illustrate that it's not only about, you know, the big power games and that an issue like a non-traditional security threat like climate change should also be discussed in the UN Security Council, which of course then China and Russia become a bit suspicious about, because what then if human rights would also creep in, and shouldn't we concentrate only on the hard security issues? So, you know, there is some focus from the EU states to also tackle this issue. Then perhaps how is the EU concerned? So it was more, you know, considered as an issue that affects others and other regions. So indeed the MENA region, and then notably the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East, also the Arctic, and also the overseas territories. So the Caribbean part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. When the hurricane Irma struck and destroyed one of the islands, this was really, you know, a shock, a wake-up call for the Netherlands. But you also have the Pacific Islands of France. So there is, let's say, this regional focus, but there certainly is also the focus on the MENA region, and that has, of course, also to do with the migration crisis. So the fear that climate change, due to its impacts on instability in the region, or due to people losing their livelihoods from farming in the region, or other, you know, means of living depending on natural resources that are no longer possible. There's this big fear that more people will, the pressure on migration to Europe will increase because of climate change. Well, anyway, so I can talk a bit more about it later, but I guess this is for now, gives you kind of introduction. Thank you.
Very interesting. And, you know, I asked about the linkage between what's happened in the Middle East and Europe, but you pointed out the importance of U.S. leadership in this area, which obviously with the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Protocol has impacts also in Europe. Thank you for that, Luis, and we will get back to some other aspects. Colin, you've done tremendous research on weather and climate change. Can you share with us some, you know, of the data and the scenarios in terms of what we are going to see here in Israel? It's 40 degrees Celsius in Israel now, middle of September, so definitely we feel it. What are we going to see here in the Middle East? And, you know, I'm talking about steady rise of temperatures and sea level rise in particular, but also if you can give us a sense of water security, food security, you could touch on all these issues.
Okay, so again, I'd also like to thank you for inviting me to this timely and important discussion. We've been pushing for these kinds of discussions for the last 30 years. I've been working in climate research since my PhD some decades ago. When we talk about what's happening in this region and globally, normally we talk about three main parameters: the temperature, precipitation, rainfall, and sea level rise. And if we look at the temperature, starting with the temperature in Israel, we've already seen just in the last few decades, from 1950s until today, an increase in temperatures in Israel on an average of 1 degree. Globally, the global temperatures have gone up 1 degree over the last 100 years. And so we're seeing a much more rapid increase in temperatures here in the Middle East and in Israel. This is obviously being translated into increased heat waves, droughts, which we've been seeing quite a few this summer. Just 2 weeks ago, I was up in the north in the Sea of Galilee with my family for a vacation, and we simply couldn't go outside until 6 in the evening. It was like 44 degrees or higher, and it was just unbearable to be outside. And this could become the norm in the future. Are people going to be able to go outside? The impacts on the economy. the summers are going to be getting longer, the winters are going to be getting shorter, and we're seeing this continuously, the breaking in record temperatures, and this is predicted, obviously, to continue into the future, depending on the various scenarios that we take, depending on what we're going to do with renewable energies, greenhouse gas emissions into the future. One of the key things that happen when you have increased temperatures is that the vegetation also loses its moisture. And this we heard about already today. People have mentioned the fires we're seeing today in California, in Australia 6 months ago, but here in Israel too. In 2010, 2016, we had huge fires in Haifa. People were killed, property was damaged. And although people are the ones igniting the fires, the damage caused by these fires and the rate of spread of the fires, wildfires, is due to the climate and climate change. The vegetation is much drier. We're having much more intense winds during these storms, lower relative humidity, and therefore the area burned and the damage is definitely due to climate change. And it's clear that what's happening in the west coast of the US today is related to climate change. The increase in number of fires, the area burned, the statistics are just showing that this is changing over time and will continue into the future. In Israel, the heat impacts have direct impact on tourism. Research has shown that tourists don't like to be in places which are above, say, 37 degrees Celsius. If the summers are going to be above 40 degrees in Israel in the future, we're not going to have too many tourists coming here in the future, and most of the tourist season is really in the summer when the kids have time of school, although the tourists may come in the winter, but this could have a major impact on tourism in Israel. I'd like to repeat what we heard from John and Shira about the drought in Syria, because this is something I think which can occur again and can spread to other countries. And I think this is one of the major threats to national security in Israel, not the internal threat, the external threat around us. And for those who are not familiar with this, there was a very intense drought from 2005 to 2010 in Syria. And this basically resulted in the wells drying up. The farmers had no water for their crops, and there was a massive migration from the rural areas into the urban regions. In Damascus, there was increased population. People were taking over the jobs from the locals. This was causing friction between different groups and sectors. People without jobs were getting recruited to shady organizations. And this led in 2011 to the uprising. It was one of the triggers, maybe not the only one, to the uprising. And if we go down the line, this eventually caused a massive migration of refugees out of Syria and many of them into Europe. And this continues today. We see what happened in Greece just a few days ago with the fires and the refugees which are in Greece, which came through Turkey and from Syria. This can easily happen again, and it can happen in Jordan, it can happen in Egypt. And so this is, I think, a major threat when we talk about national security in our part of the world. That's related to temperature. Let's talk about rainfall. So we've been seeing in Israel, the models predict a decrease of maybe 20% in rainfall in Israel by the end of the century. We see this across the Mediterranean. In Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and in Israel, there's a definite trend of decreasing rainfall over the rainy season. But something strange is happening, is that while we're having less water at the end of the season, the rainfall that does come is coming in downpours and producing flash floods, urban flooding, where the rains basically cannot be drained away fast enough. And even this year, we had people dying in Israel due to flooding in the cities in the winter. But at the end of the season, we're left with less water because we're getting less rainfall over the year. Finally, sea level rise. And for Israel, this is maybe not a major impact, except for winter storms, where we can expect to see much higher waves, the peak in the surf, which is causing erosion of our coastline, of our beaches. Some of the cities like Netanya are built right on the edge of the cliff, and this can be obviously dangerous in the continued erosion over the years. But again, I'd like to point to our neighbor to the south. If we look at Egypt and the Nile Delta, today there's 6.1 million people living in 1 meter of sea level. The population in Egypt is going to double in the next 30 years. There are 100 million today. It's going to be 200 million by 2050. With sea level rise, with the decrease in rainfall, increase in population, increase in temperatures and heat waves, we are going to see a massive problem with climate refugees. Some of those are going to go to Europe, but just a small fraction, less than 1%, come knocking on our southern border. We're going to have a huge problem with refugees looking for water and food on our southern border. And this can be from Egypt, it could be from similar things to what happened in Syria, and also from Jordan coming from the east. So I think the major threat to Israel for national security is really from our neighbors around us due to food security, water security, and sea level rise. So I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Colin. Really appreciate it. And maybe the silver lining is as Israel goes into a second lockdown, it's too hot to go outside anyway, with the predictions you have. Sherry, I'd like to go back to you now. You know, growing up in Israel, we always were taught that water wars are going to come. There are going to be wars between countries over water resources. And these wars really did occur in the past. Even though we haven't seen those big water wars in, you know, recent decades, the concept of water conflict still exists. And in the Middle East, that is one of the most arid regions in the world, and what Colin just described is going to become even more arid. Can you tell us a little bit about the strategic importance of water and the concept of water conflict in this region and in other regions?
Well, sure, Shira. Thank you very much. And thank you all for your remarks. I learned quite a bit about the specifics of what's happening in Israel today. You know, water has always been a source of cooperation, but sometimes a source of conflict and instability, as we well know, going back to biblical times. Now, Israel, since its inception, has seen and treated water as an element of its own national power, creating a national water system, a national water carrier, something that most countries don't have. In the U.S., water is managed at a very local and regional level, not in a national level. Of course, the geography is very different. You know, if you think of the major river basins, some of the major river basins in the Middle East that are the source of instability today. We just talked about Egypt and sea level rise, but there's also there along the Nile, the Grand Renaissance Dam being erected, which is going to exacerbate the problems we just learned about for those living on the coastlines in the fertile regions of Egypt, and is going to make the problems so much worse as the dams create potential either flooding or lack of water in certain regions of the Nile, in addition to the salination problem faced for some of the agricultural regions along the coastline as the sea level rise brings salty water into those agricultural regions. Now, you know, there has been a lot of hydro diplomacy, and there was a time when the U.S. and others were really leading in that area. I think there are still opportunities there. They're not as front and center perhaps as they could be now, but I think that the opportunities for managing these river basins and for managing there is increasingly important. What we haven't seen, fortunately, is as much armed conflict related to those river basins, but there's instability that is growing and migration that's occurring and food insecurity. We talked about Syria and Darfur already, places where prolonged drought has exacerbated the problems of food security for farmers and herders, driven people to the cities. We're seeing the same along major river basins, the Tigris and Euphrates. Of course, you well know, you know, in your region, the Jordan River, which I saw, you know, just when I was last there about 2 years ago now, you know, has slowed to a trickle and doesn't provide the source of water. In fact, is often a source of sewage flow in certain regions. And so that's been somewhat a source of cooperation between Israel and Jordan, but I think there's a lot more opportunity to improve that in the future. I mean, I think that there is a whole new field, particularly those in the Netherlands, like Louise and her colleagues, you know, have developed and really perfected the field of water management and hydro diplomacy and exported that as a talent globally. And I think there are more opportunities to see this as part of our renewal. Also, I'd say, you know, coming now with the new agreements with the UAE and Bahrain and the investments that have been made in water technologies in some of the Arab nations, along, of course, with Israel, there may be more opportunities to think creatively about how we can manage these water conflicts in a more constructive way at the local level. I think we have sometimes underappreciated the ability of local actors and citizen groups and local groups to be able to come up with creative solutions. We've seen some progress, for example, around Lake Chad, not as much as we need, but some progress over the last decade or so in improving the water and food security situation around Lake Chad, bordered by 4 African nations, which has shrunk to a fraction of its size. And now there are some, although could be more, opportunities to improve that. So I think we have to think creatively as we move forward. We have, of course, in Asia, it's a whole nother story where China controls the water tower of Asia and is in a position to really limit water flows to certain of its downstream riparian neighbors in India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, who are all very vulnerable. And those water sharing arrangements and hydro diplomacy, where I think Israel, this could be a sort of competitive export for Israel with its talent and technology in the future. So I in that sense, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to move forward in some of these areas.
Thank you, Sherry. John, Sherry just spoke about water technology. No question, Israel is an expert in this. One of the solutions for water shortages is, of course, desalination, but that is extremely energy intensive. You've worked a lot on the issue of energy efficiency. Can you explain what that is? And I think just because it is a historical day with Israel signing normalization agreements with Persian Gulf countries, how may this issue of energy affect stability in this part of the world, in the GCC oil and gas exporting countries?
Sure. So I think it's important to understand that when energy comes up, it most often comes up, at least when we're talking about climate, in the context of emissions. And so in the United States, in the U.S. military, there were conversations, I want to say 10 years ago or so, about how can we reduce our energy use in order to limit our climate change impacts. What we found at that point in time was that wasn't as much of a motivator as self-interest. Could we increase efficiency to save money? Could we implement renewable energy projects, not just to save money, but to improve mission effectiveness? When you bring in, once again, that sort of self-interest perspective, there was plenty of motivation to move the ball forward and to improve your energy efficiency performance. This is going to vary based on agency, based on country, based on available resources. One of the challenges we've always had in the U.S. context is scale and available resources for increasing energy efficiency, because you can't get at every single piece of infrastructure that is 100 years old. There's just too much. And so it would take an enormous investment to increase the efficiency of all of the enterprise. And so the efforts have had mixed success. You add that to the sort of global footprint, and there are a lot of installations that the US has in the Middle East or in Europe where we don't have complete control over the efficiency, over the facilities, and over what kinds of efficiency measures are put in place. And you put somebody in a theater of operations, say Afghanistan, and the soldiers there aren't going to be paying attention to energy efficiency as much as they are going to be paying attention to the actual conflict. And so it's very easy for it to fall off the priority list. There were stories about soldiers who would just open their door and blast the air conditioning because they wanted to, and nobody was going to question them because they had just gotten off of a long mission, and that was a waste of energy, but in the micro sense, that wasn't questioned. And so the dynamics become ones of self-interest. I will go back to let me hit two related points. You want to be able to make the case that people are going to either improve their water management or improve their energy efficiency for their self-interest. They're not doing it for the global commons or the sort of climate impacts. They're doing it because there is always a tangible improvement and interest of their own when they do this. And you need to make that case. I think whether you want me to talk about it now or not, I think there's a related discussion to have about the emissions that are contributing to global warming from militaries, because they tend to be very large and very energy intensive enterprises. And if you like, I can talk about that for a couple minutes, or we can pause and go around the table a little bit more.
Sorry, please go ahead. You started. Would love to hear about it briefly.
So briefly, what this has come up in the in the media in the context of the U.S. military, which is fairly large and has a pretty big carbon footprint. The comparison that was made by some academics was that the U.S. military has more emissions than countries like Portugal and Sweden. That is accurate, but it is also accurate to say that the U.S. military has about 3 million people, which compares to the number of people in those countries. Also, the amount of the U.S. military budget compares to the GDPs of those countries. And so it becomes an issue of not whether the U.S. military is emitting, or any military is emitting this much because it's a military, but because it's large. And so that context is important. Then you start to peel back. So energy efficiency and renewable energy became very big priorities for us when I was at the Department of Defense. But when you ask the question, where do the emissions come from? That's not the main source. The main source is fuel. And if you peel it back even further in the U.S. context, it's airplane fuel. Airplanes dominate the emissions profile of the U.S. military. And it's not necessarily the fighter planes. It's the big cargo airplanes and the refueling airplanes. It's the wide bodies. The bigger the airplane, the more fuel it uses. And so if you want to compare apples to apples, and you look at the U.S. military's carbon footprint, and you compare the U.S. Air Force to American Airlines pre-COVID, American Airlines is bigger. And if you look at only the U.S. air carriers and compare it to the U.S. military is dwarfed. Just the U.S. air carriers are a far, far, far bigger carbon footprint than the U.S. military. And so you begin to see the impact of air travel, and you begin to see the impact of a global enterprise. Because part of the reason they have those airplanes and the cargo aircraft that they have is because they're moving things to the Middle East and back, or to the Pacific and back. And when you try and operate a global enterprise, you're gonna have, with airplanes, you're gonna have a huge carbon footprint. And so it is more that factor than tanks or trucks or all those other pieces of the puzzle. Those aren't what drives the footprint. The footprint is driven by the air travel and by maintaining that global footprint. And so getting after that is a whole different problem. And you're not going to solve that by reducing the number of aircraft carriers you have or other notions like that, or even becoming energy efficient in your facilities. That's not what's going to drive the numbers. You'll make small improvements then. But if you really want to impact the bigger problem, rather than just feel good about your efficiency, then if you're going to impact the bigger problem, you have to get at the sources of the emissions. And so then you have to start working on technology to solve those problems, or to stop taking airplanes. I mean, that's not a real solution, though. And so so then we have to get at, well, how do we do it without emitting?
And there's another option, which we'll get to in next round, but this is really concerning. Luis, you started touching upon, at the very end of your remarks, the idea that climate change in this region leads to forced migration, which affects Europe. Are there any reliable estimates of the number of people who are on the move today or will be on the move today as a result of environmental factors? Can we say this is they're moving or displaced because of that reason, not another. And whether we have accurate numbers or not, you said it's a problem from Europe, but can you explain a little bit in more detail how this affects EU's security? And of course, we mentioned Syria, we mentioned Egypt, but Europe is also, is vulnerable to migration from North Africa and other parts of Africa as well.
Yeah, so no, there are no independent, reliable data on how many more migrants would come to Europe because of climate change. And the reason is, A, because it's very difficult to research, because we know that migration is always a combination of different motivations. But also B, because every time somebody publishes something, it's harshly attacked. So it's a super contested, politically sensitive issue, and it's also in some circles even politically almost incorrect to suggest that many more migrants would come to Europe because of climate change. In Europe, it's also super sensitive to make the connection between migration and security, because then you would say, all these asylum seekers are terrorists, and so it's for understandable reasons, it's very sensitive. At the same time, we know that because of migration, of course, pressure in some parts of society is mounting. There is fears for migration, and there's also a link with the rise of populist parties, and even the Brexit was related to fears for migration. So in a way, migration is a political issue, but it's a very sensitive political issue, because, and also it's an issue where Europe also of course doesn't want to ruin its relationship with its neighboring countries. Europe is super concerned about the instability. European policymakers, even in speeches, have included the link between climate change and migration, but the data available are not really there, or they are super contested. So, and let me go back to this also, this issue of that it's so difficult. I mean, in a way, it's also true, because we know that if people migrate, they usually have reasons why they want to leave their, country of origin. But we also know that, let's say, the prospects in the countries of destination and the way the migration pattern can be facilitated. So if there is a process with human smugglers in place, if it's affordable, if they have the resource, so if there is the opportunity to migrate. So it's always often it's a combination of these factors. And then it can also be, it's not always, in 1 year. So people might, because of climate change, living on the countryside in Syria, have to move to the first nearby city. Then there is tensions in the city, and 5 years later, they will have to go on the move, maybe to neighboring Jordan. But then in Jordan, in 3 years' time, it's also a difficult situation. They manage to make a living out of something, to make some savings or have some money from relatives, and they try to go to Turkey, then they go to Greece, then they go to Europe. So there is also not a linear path of migration. So there is some research, with asylum seekers in Greece that indicates that climate change was part of the motivation. Everybody expects this is part of the motivation, but let's say the hard evidence, the data are always very much disputed, discussed, contested. Yeah, let's put it like that. But I think behind a lot of the programs that are being set up on development, also on food, water, you can see that, let's say, the climate migration link is, is present also in the policymaker's mind. I hope this clarifies.
Yes, absolutely.
Kira, perhaps I could talk a little bit about another region where I think the climate migration links are becoming even more clear, and that is here in the northern hemisphere, in the increasing migration from Central America through Mexico into the United States. And here you see in Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, and Colombia, parts of the regions that were where coffee was the main staple. The coffee crop has, in many of those areas, now been devastated, partly by prolonged droughts and climate extremes. And that has cost the livelihoods of many in that region. Now, there, of course, are other political instabilities and violent extremist forces and narco-terrorists. I'm not there. That's all part of the mix. But because people can no longer support their families, they're moving northward, moving into Mexico, and moving towards the United States. And that wave of migration is likely to continue until we can find more sustainable agriculture and water security for that region.
Thank you, Sherry. This is a very good addition. Colin, Knesset member Miki Khaimovich, she spoke about some lack of preparation, but you've been in this about the threats that we're likely to see in the near and medium term future. Is there different preparation level for each type of these threats?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying that at least the government in Israel recognizes that climate change is a problem. Unlike some other leaders around the world, at least they agree that there's a problem. Doesn't necessarily mean they're doing too much about it. But Israel did sign on to the Paris Agreement, Paris 2015 Agreement. And so there is a general acceptance, I think, that climate change is real and there is a problem. 2018, the Ministry of Environment came out with a big report about adaptation to climate change. But not much has been done, basically because there are no budgets for this. As many of you know, in Israel, there are many other priorities may be more important than climate change. So we have many reports on the table of things that can be done, but I think we're way behind the other OECD countries on implementation of these reports. But these reports are basically looking at adaptation. No one really thinks that Israel can do much about mitigation of climate change. Being such a small country, even if we stopped all of our emissions today, climate change is going to keep on going and still impacting Israel. And so most of the effort has been on adaptation to heat waves, to changes in water resources, rainfall, maybe sea level rise. And there's actually been not much transferred to renewable energies. We're way behind many other countries, even European countries, with the amount of renewable energies in the mix of energy that we have in Israel. But I actually think that Israel can be part of the solution when we're talking about mitigation. Someone mentioned before about the water technologies here in Israel and how in the last decades, Israel has become a world leader in water technologies, recycling water. Israel recycles nearly 86% of all of its sewage. We use all the water again. We have the desalination plants. We're a leader in water technologies, and there's no reason that Israel cannot be a leader also in energy technologies for the future, whether it's solar or wind, also in the transportation, agriculture, and lead the way in many areas like we did with water. And so I don't think we should back away from being part of the solutions and the mitigation technologies. One of the problems is that we discovered huge reservoirs of gas off the coast a few years ago in Israel, and huge investments were in those discoveries, and the government wants to recover those investments. And so there's not too much will to leave that gas in the ground and move to renewable energies, and there's more the waiting game until we can return those investments, and then maybe in some time in the future we'll move more heavily to renewable energies. With that said, one thing that has actually had a lot of investment is in the field of smart mobility. Now, I wouldn't say this is necessarily about climate change, although many of these new technologies, electric cars, batteries, will actually help in the energy sector, transportation sector, to reduce greenhouse gases and may have long-term impacts on the climate. In fact, at Tel Aviv University, in my school, we actually have an accelerator for startup companies called Capsula at Tel Aviv University, where we bring every 6 months startup companies in the field of smart mobility. And I should point out, this is funded by the Prime Minister's office. So this is funding from the government and the Innovation Authority. And so here they actually have made huge investments in smart mobility to promote this area, whether it's autonomous cars, electric vehicles, battery storage. And in fact, we did too good a job because they've cut our funding now because the market is running by itself. There are hundreds of companies now in Israel in smart mobility. And this can be done also with climate change, looking for solutions for climate change in all the different sectors, and especially in the energy sector. So I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thank you, Colin. I want to go back to you, Sherry. I know the Middle East is really far from the Arctic region, but you mentioned it and John mentioned it. And climate change there, obviously, they affect global competition and the security landscape. And can you share with us the importance of these developments and how they relate to the great power competition that we see now between the United States and China and Russia? I know this is an area you are passionate about.
Yes. Well, I mean, the Arctic is an ocean that's opened up in our lifetime. We have a whole new region that is now navigable, that is open to economic and potentially security competition among adversaries, Russia, China, and the great powers, because of climate change, because the sea ice is retreating, temperatures are rising, sometimes as high as 100 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of Siberia this summer, and the permafrost is collapsing, making life dangerous for those who live in the Arctic, because the infrastructure was designed to be built on solid permafrost, and now we see a vast diesel spill across parts of the Russian Arctic at Nornickel, with potentially widespread ecological damage. Now we have Russia, which has a very long Arctic coastline and is trying to monetize the northern sea route that runs along its coastline for potential shipping routes from Asia to Europe, creating a toll road for transit across that area and encouraging. Putin has set very ambitious goals for transit along the northern sea route. Russia's also militarizing its portion of the Arctic. It's reinstating military bases that had closed after the Cold War, taking more aggressive tactics against our Nordic allies and against the U.S., including just recently off the coast of Alaska, buzzing fishermen who felt threatened, Alaskan fishermen in the Bering Strait. So we see much more aggressive activity. My deep concern also, because I've spent a lot of time working on nuclear matters, nuclear issues, is Russia's nuclearization of the Arctic. And we know that Russia does not have a great nuclear safety record, from Chernobyl to the sinking of the Kursk submarine, which lost many sailors' lives, to many other nuclear safety incidents. We see those risks increasing as Russia puts more nuclear power into the Arctic, either in the form of icebreakers, floating nuclear power stations, and other nuclear capable vessels. So that's a particular concern of mine. Now we see China also asserting its Arctic ambitions, declaring a polar Silk Road as an addition to its Belt and Road Transportation Initiative across parts of Asia and Africa and into the Middle East, declaring itself to be a near Arctic stakeholder, something that the U.S. and others have rejected, as China, of course, has no Arctic territory. Many nations, including China and others, certainly have opportunities and legitimate opportunities to conduct research in the region. That's ongoing in many aspects, but there have been times where we see more Chinese vessels off the coast of Alaska in the summer than the U.S., which brings us to the U.S. needing to increase its presence in the Arctic region because we've let our icebreaking and other capabilities lapse in recent years. Now we have a sort of crash course on rebuilding our polar security cutters or our icebreakers and resetting our forces to be able to operate in a more open Arctic. At the same time, the research and observations of environmental change continue to be paramount, and that's where nations like Israel and the United States and others that have strong research institutions continue to need to have presence in the region to understand the rate of change in a region where the rate of change really is outpacing the ability of humans to adapt to that catastrophic change.
Thank you. So another strategic arena for what sounds like more cooperation, more competition than cooperation, sadly. John, you started saying before, you told us about emissions by the US military. I want to go back maybe the other way and ask, what risks does climate change, more generally, not talk, pose to militaries? And if you can also comment about how that might affect climate change, might affect U.S. military posture in the region. You said that there are two solutions for not being flying equipment and people to the Middle East. You spoke about not flying anymore. You spoke about inventing new technologies. There's also another option of withdrawing from the Middle East, which would be very concerning to U.S. allies and partners in this region. So I'm just curious if you can speak a little bit about the effect on military bases, and in our region also.
So, and to be clear, when I was talking about not flying anymore, I was being facetious. But I wasn't actually seriously proposing that, but it is part of the driver.
Anymore, so.
Yes. So I think that's important, and then let me tee off of something that Sherry just said too. When we're talking about the Arctic and we're talking about great power competition, that's another example of finding the issues, the climate change driven issues, where it's already an issue you were paying attention to, and climate change affects it and shapes it. We already were paying attention to great power competition, and the Arctic ice melting created a new venue for that competition, and it's shaping it again. So how does it shape military capabilities? I think there's a bunch of different ways, and I'm not going to be able to list them all, but let me list a few. Infrastructure is the most present one, so it is the nearest term, and while we have sea level rise at Navy bases, it comes as no surprise that most Navy bases are on the coast, and so you're getting significant increases in water, but it's more the storm surge and the extreme weather that adds to that, and every storm has a greater impact, therefore, that you get the sort of spikes in impact. And when you have a hurricane or another large storm, that spike is even bigger. And so in the United States, we've had a couple of military bases that have taken billions of dollars of damage. And when you start talking about billions to members of Congress who are in charge of appropriations, they start paying attention. And so, again, it's less about the climate change than it is about the billions of dollars. But that infrastructure, when we talk about impacts on those bases, the military tries to couch it these days so as they don't get afoul of the politics. There's natural threats, there's physical threats, there's cyber threats, and all of those things happen. But only one of them has taken out an entire basin in the last couple of years, and that was the hurricane in Florida, which leveled Tyndall Air Force Base and took it out for a month. Well, that's a readiness impact. The wildfires, forced evacuations of bases. There are multiple examples in the last few years of U.S. military bases that have had to evacuate because of wildfires. Not just now. This is not new. The scope might be new, and the scale might be new, and so you get people in the United States worried about energy security or an energy resilience. What they mean by that isn't, do I have assured flow of oil from the Middle East? They mean, can I continue to operate when the power grid goes down? And can I, inside my fence line, continue to operate? And so there's an enormous amount of effort going on in that context, because the military, frankly, believes that the grid will go down, whether it's from a wildfire or a storm, because now it is not some sort of wild contingency that they're going to lose power for a couple of weeks. They plan for it because they expect it to happen. And so that kind of military impact and that kind of planning is one big area. It affects training, extreme heat, what you're dealing with. Most of the U.S. Training bases are in the southern part of the United States, and they deal with increasing numbers of what they call black flag days, where it's too hot to have people run, and that impacts training schedules. As extreme heat increases, you get more and more and more of those days, and it impacts readiness. So there are those impacts. One of the impacts in the Middle East that we've seen that the people are dealing with already is that when you have high heat and humidity days, you cannot carry as much on your aircraft. And so that affects payload, and that affects whether people can fly, and that affects a whole range of other military operational questions that they're going to have to wrestle with, and has to be integrated in. Is it the only factor they have to pay attention to? No, it's not the only factor, but it is a factor, and you ignore it at your peril. And I don't think they're ignoring it. I think that it's becoming something that they have to pay attention to and have to calculate in more and more, though. And I guess I would close with the other piece of the military puzzle that folks are going to have to pay attention to is where you're going to have to fight. So as you look globally at stability, you know, there are problems that are going to erupt in different parts of the world because of climate stress. And is it the only factor? It's never the only factor. It's one of many factors. But as you start to look around the world, where are you going to have to deploy? Humanitarian assistance and disaster response is one of those factors. The U.S. military responds to those often. Other militaries respond to it as well, and they respond to stuff internal. Domestic questions. If you have domestic disasters, you have to respond to those. Increasing amounts of those crises means an increasing demand on your military. And so you have to think about, do I have a big enough military to deal with this? Or am I going to start to say no when people ask for help? That's another question you have to wrestle with. So anyway, I've listed off a bunch of things. I have a bunch more. I could probably fill up all of your time, and I'll stop now.
It just means we need to do this again. But I mean, you did say it will affect where you fight, if you're ready for this fight, and how you fight, which I think those are big questions. Luis, I wanted to ask you, if you've done a lot of work on food and water security, can you talk a little bit about the potential scenarios for the Middle East, sort of 30 years down the line? And then if you can also touch on briefly, do you see this as an area for potential collaboration between the EU and Israel?
Yeah. So, yeah, the scenarios, if you look at them, it's all very bad. Huh? It's very negative. That being said, if you look indeed at water and food and land, these are scarce resources and they're becoming increasingly scarce because of climate change. But also because of a range of other factors, such as the dams being built, the mismanagement, the agricultural subsidies which are in place, which may lead to overconsumption of water. And in this respect, I think indeed that the experience of Israel is very interesting. So Israel has managed to deal with desertification. It has a high water scarce agricultural practices and food security policies. And I think I would find it interesting if, let's say, Israel would cooperate and share more of these practices with European countries and maybe also help in that respect. And I think also that comes to the more general question. So with the EU, we see that it takes climate change really, really serious. Also in the Green Deal, in its external policies, 30% of the EU budget for 2021 till 2027 is to go to climate change related activities. So including in the neighborhood policies of the EU. So there will be, let's say, a lookout for such, expertise, sharing best practices. And I think there's also a lot of opportunity for cooperation. So as also your member of the Knesset said, climate change is an external force. It's interfering with our lives. It's undermining our instability or undermining our stability. And that is also very much an entry point to start new discussions, whether it be at the local level, such as what, for instance, EcoPeace is currently doing. I'm a big admirer of them. Or between countries, if you discuss indeed dams, dam building, transboundary waters, even transboundary groundwaters you can have. But climate change is, it's not the traditional enemy, which also makes it easier because it affects everybody to use it as an entry point for environmental peace building, for new talks between also groups in societies, the farmers versus other water users. We at Klingendael run the Planetary Security Initiative project. We have a website. It's a hub for knowledge on this issue. We hope also to publish in the future your research if it's policy oriented. So we refrain from the academic. We really want to have solution oriented work. And with this, we also look at, for instance, the case of Iraq, what could be done in terms of water management. And we really hope to contribute in that way. And we also hope, let's say, these new programs will be supported. It's not always only about money. It's also about diplomats, about security actors, just paying attention to this climate lens.
And prioritizing this issue. I apologize cutting you close. I do want to get to Colin with the very last question, and we are running short on time. Colin, as you know, Israel normalizes ties with other countries in the region. Maybe you can tell us just a little bit about the potential for climate diplomacy for scientists just such as yourself, but with other countries in the region. We need to be brief, unfortunately.
Okay.
But
so I think to make progress on climate solutions, we need both the innovation and we also need the financial backing. And so here I think we have a great combination with these new agreements with the Gulf states. Israel brings the innovative, thinking out of the box mentality, and the Gulf states can also bring the capital to support these innovative solutions. So this could actually be a game changer, I think, for climate change, bringing the people in the Gulf and the people in Israel together to find solutions together. This is a unique opportunity, I think, and we're definitely going to be promoting this both through the university and also nationally. It's interesting that Christiana Figueres, who was the architect of the Paris 2015 agreement, she said the most difficult country to get on signing the agreement was Saudi Arabia. She went there personally. I met her personally in Israel, and she said that she couldn't believe that once she had convinced them to sign, the king of Saudi Arabia told her that he wishes to live to the day that they export their last barrel of oil coming from Saudi Arabia. So the oil superpowers can convert to becoming the solar superpowers maybe of the future. Today, China has a grand plan, a grand vision for the future of basically connecting the whole planet with renewable energy and selling that energy to everyone. They want to build huge solar farms in northern Africa, sell that energy to Europe, and this collaboration with the Gulf states may allow the Gulf states to actually move away from fossil fuels and to develop the technologies and the energy to actually produce solar energy, become solar powers, storing that energy in batteries of the future, whether it's in fuel cells or producing hydrogen. And we don't want to leave this only to the Chinese in the future. And so I think there's both a geopolitical role here, but also an innovative and technological cooperation which can really move us ahead with solutions for climate change.
thank you very much, Colin. Thank you, all of you, Sherry, John, Luis, and Colin again. I have a lot more questions. We have more questions from the audience, but we ran out of time, which means we'll just have to do it again. To close this conference, I welcome Brigadier General Udi Dekel, the Managing Director of ISS. Thank you all.
Thank you all the experts. It was very interesting, and we have the taste of more. And this is one of the outcomes that we would like to achieve from this activity. I can say something about our institute that was established after Yom Kippur War as some of lesson learned that we have to do something like strategic assessment to the government of Israel in order to prepare Israel for future challenges. And I can tell you that along the years, we didn't deal with climate and not with the pandemic and this kind of events. The main events were security, especially in our region, speaking about security. Every year we conduct strategic assessment to the government, and there wasn't any mention about the COVID-19 there. And in the beginning of the year, we did a big conference, international conference here in Tel Aviv, which was very, very successful, but we didn't mention a word about the climate or the COVID-19 pandemic or other things. So this, for us, a lesson learned that we have to be more open and deal with these issues. And the idea that Shira decided to take the lead in order to create a program, research program in our institute, this is something very important, and we are working together with Tel Aviv University and the people there, and I hope that this will initiate important discussions and especially decisions here in Israel. You know, we are in era which most of the dealing is for the next 24 hours and not looking upon the future. In the military, you still, because you have to build up the force, you have to deal with threats that you have to engage maybe 10 years from now. But on the other items, we don't look upon 10 years from now. And this is something that we would like to put on the table. And we understood that this is important issue to the state of Israel and to the region. I can say that today we are speaking about, an hour from now, there will be the discussions or there will be the ceremony in the White House about the new agreement or new relations, normal relations between Israel and UAE and Bahrain. But I can tell you that along the years, we sat together with experts from those, the Gulf states, in order to start thinking about what kind of regional cooperation we need. And it was very interesting because we spoke about the issues that you mentioned here during that short conference, all the issue of our road here, the water security, the food security, the issue of the temperature, you know that 30 years from now, maybe people will not be able in the Middle East to be out of the air condition during the summer, energy, migration, issue of transportation, ground, air, and naval transportation, and of course all the other aspects which coming from that. And this is an issue. This is the consequences for the issue of the climate, and we are ready to discuss it. And I hope that this agreement, the new agreement with those countries, will promote this cooperation between Israel and other Middle East countries, because we have to be ready for the future. And we know very well from the military language that the readiness is a key word. So a readiness upon other challenges like the climate challenges, this is something important, and I hope that we will be more open now in Israel to be ready to discuss and to be, open for this aspect. So we learn a lot from your experience, and thank you very much for that. As I said before, this is the beginning, this is the initiate point, and I assume that we will do things together in the future as long as we will understand better the subject, and we will ask you more questions and more ideas how we have to deal with this challenge. So thank you very much, everybody, Sherry, Louise, Colin, Shira, John, Gal here, Ezra, and Erez and more in our institute. And I hope that it contributes for the discussions, not only for us, which are involved in that, also for other people to understand something. And I can tell you that we did a public opinion poll in Israel last week, and we checked the people, what is the main threat for them today. In the past, always, it was security threat. People spoke here in Israel about security threat. This is the first time that the people said, first of all, health, second, economy, and later on, the security. So I assume that in the near future, climate will be one of important things which the people of Israel will recognize that this is an issue that we have to take into consideration and to be ready for that. Again, thank you very much, and see you soon.